To overclock or not overclock? For this video, well, that is the question. So here recently I got a couple comments on the videos we did with the, I guess you could say, the Micro Center build that we picked up a few months ago. You can check that story out down in the description box below. But I got a few questions or comments on a few of those videos about the overclocking potential of the RTX 40 series, or more importantly, the RTX 4070 Super. Now, I have the MSI Gaming X Slim variant. It can already boost up to about 2600 megahertz or 2.6 gigahertz, which is incredibly high, right? Like, we're in an age where graphics cards are automatically overclocking themselves past their boost clock frequencies, and that's well surpassing the 2000 megahertz range. And the graphics cards are surpassing that limitation all on their own. I'm not quite sure how well the silicone overclocks underneath of my RTX 4070 Super, but in this video, we are definitely going to find out. Now, a few things to keep in mind about overclocking. One, definitely could lead your system to be unstable and more than just the application you're intended to play, and that you're also attempting to, run a successful overclock in, like not have your system crash in the middle of a synthetic benchmark, or you're running it through 3D Mark. But you are dealing with increasing things like power draws and temperatures, and those things can shorten the lifespan of your graphics card. It's a little bit more, I guess you could say, productive to overclock older graphics cards, and that way you can possibly get them up to speed to run just a little faster here in modern games. But typically an overclock won't yield significant gains in terms of FPS, and considering what you're exchanging as far as a trade-off, that's power and temperatures, like a higher TDP, a higher power draw. But an MSI will have to adjust, say, the maximum power draw and how high the GPU can reach in terms of its temperature. And on top of that, the ambient temperature I'm recording in is relatively low. As you can see here, about 25 degrees C. So it's not necessarily hot, and your ambient temperature will play a factor in your overclock. I am running this setup on an open air configuration, but inside of a case like the Cooler Master one behind the test setup, your temperature would very much be higher than what I'll see with this graphics card being an open test setup. But I'm eager to see how far can this graphics card overclock, and what are the benefits to achieving an overclock. And if we damage the component in the process, then that is just part of the process. So we're going to see if overclocking is still a viable aspect or angle you should take in newer graphics cards, more particularly the RTX 4070 Super, the potential gains, the pros and the cons, all that jazz. And again, our target, 3000 megahertz. So let's jump right into it and see how it plays out. Okay, now here we are in MSI AFTERBURNER, and just to go over a few of the settings here really fast, you have your GPU core clock frequency. Right now it's sitting at 210 megahertz because the graphics card essentially isn't doing anything special or particularly I guess you could say, running any graphic task in the background. It's just outputting video. And then you have the memory core clock frequency, or have the memory frequency here, right underneath the GPU core clock frequency. We're also going to be overclocking that as well, and that's double the data rate, or DDR. And so we're going to multiply that number times 2. And then you have your current voltage, which I'm not going to touch in this overclock. A bit too advanced, and what we're trying to achieve is just a little unnecessary. Plus, you might want to introduce some exotic cooling if you're going to mess around with the voltage. And then the ever so important figure here, and that is our GPU temperature, which again is also sitting at 27 degrees Celsius because the graphics card isn't doing anything. And now just below here, you have your voltage settings. Again, we're not going to touch those. And then here's where all the magic happens, right? Like right here on the GPU core clock frequency, this is where we adjust our memory and our core clock speed. We're also running NVIDIA GeForce drivers 560.70. And right here is where we also adjust our fan speed and our power limit and our temp limits. We're also likely going to go with a manual fan speed here because I don't want the graphics card doing anything in the background, just focusing on trying to achieve a stable overclock. And now we're going to open up Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Good old test bench software there. We're going to run its synthetic benchmark just to see what the numbers are, or to get a baseline as to how the graphics card performs without the overclock. Now I'm going to be running all the games at the base resolution of this monitor, which is 2560 by 1440p. And that's also because we're going to run a 3D Mark 1440p benchmark to also test the overclock. And then just looking over our settings here really fast, you can see we're running DirectX 12. The resolution is set to 2560 by 1440p. NVIDIA RTX DLSS is off. We're running full screen. We might need to change that so I can open up MSI Afterburner. But we're also running on a 165 hertz monitor. Not that that matters too much for the sake of our overclock. Then jump right over here to the graphics settings. Everything's just about turned all the way up. We're going to run the synthetic benchmarks to see how high our GPU cores boost without the overclock, how hot the temperature gets, and of course, what our baseline FPS looks like. And now we're here running the first part of the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark, and you can see the graphics card is boosting up to about 2,805 megahertz or almost 3 gigahertz. And remember, that's our target. So we might actually be able to achieve an even higher overclock, being that the graphics card, at least in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, is boosting up to that number, that 3,000 mark, by itself without anything else going on in the background. And even in the second part of the GPU benchmark, and I consider this area a little bit more graphically intensive, as you can see, because there's so many different things going on with the foliage and the leaves, and Laura's hair is bouncing as she walks. So there's a lot going on here. But again, the graphics card is boosting up to not as high in the previous scene, but only about 20 to 30 megahertz off. But so far the numbers look good. So we're not that far off from my target. Originally, I said plus maybe 400 on the core, 800 on the memory, but it looks like we can maybe even achieve an even more conservative overclock and still achieve that number. And okay, now I have MSI Afterburner and Shadow of the Tomb Raider open also in the background. And now that we know what our baseline is, I'm going to go ahead and apply a plus 50 on the core overclock and a plus 100 overclock on the memory, because I want to get to that 3,000 megahertz number just a little bit quicker. I'm going to dial in a nasty overclock, but what I recommend is you start in about 10 megahertz increments, slowly build up from there until you reach an instability. For example, go plus 10, 20 on the core, plus 40 on the, plus 40, maybe 80 on the memory, and then run your benchmark, check for instabilities, wash, rinse, recycle, repeat, right, until you run into a system crash or GPU artifacting. But again, this is a newer graphics card, newer silicon, but if you're running an older GPU, I recommend you start with those previous aforementioned steps. Now that we have our plus 50 on the core, plus 100 on the memory, our power limit is slid all the way over to the right, along with that temperature limit slid all the way to the right. And while I don't anticipate us hitting this number here, that 88 degrees C, it is good to just allow for the GPU to hit that number. So that now that we have all our numbers dialed in, I'm going to go ahead and hit the check mark here so it saves our overclock. Then I'm going to jump back in here into Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and we should see that plus 50 and plus 100, a little over on both, but about that plus 50, plus 100 on the core and on the memory. As you can see now, we're just a little over there. We are in the menu, so it's hard to tell, but we're going to jump right back in here into the benchmark. And now we're running the benchmark, and you can see that plus 50 on the core is actually reflective on the memory and on the GPU core, and about plus 200, plus 100 on the memory at 10,614 megahertz. Our GPU temperature looks fine as well. We're at about 55 degrees C, 56 degrees C. Again, I would like to get to 3,000 before we even hit 60 degrees C, but in a test like 3D Mark and its 1440p benchmark, that's likely going to be the ultimate test to see if it passes our overclock outside of the Shadow of the Tomb Raider synthetic benchmark. And even here in this scene, you also see that number is dialed in at 2850 megahertz, and we have yet to run into any significant crashes yet. So this is actually a good sign, at least going in. But newer graphics cards, most graphics cards should be able to hit plus 50 on the core at a headroom, at a max, before it runs into any instability or system issues. And so far, so good. Beyond hitting the other scenes, I more so want to see if it passes the first two initial phases of this benchmark, because this scene, along with the previous one, has a lot going on with it. The beginning scene has a lot of different, NPCs and other things going on in the backgrounds, different lighting simulations going on, and a lot of detail to render. But we're going to go ahead and add another 50 on the core and another 100 on the memory. So here we are back in MSI Afterburner, and we're going to dial that up to about plus 100, just about, give or take, on the GPU core, and then we're going to go about another 100 on the memory Just going to put us at about 210, a little over plus 100 on the memory. So right now we're at about 100 or 98 on the core and 200 on the memory. Everything else has stayed the same. I have yet to change the fan speed. I'm going to jump back in and restart the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark to see if we run into any instabilities in those beginning scenes. Now we're rocking at 150 on the core total, plus 300 on the memory. We're not quite yet close to even half my initial targeted overclock, which was 400 on the core, 800 in memory, but we are getting dangerously close, because if we can pass the first two portions of the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark, then I'm going to go ahead and up that figure to plus 100 on the core, plus 200 on the memory. Okay, now here we are in the beginning portion of the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. I don't see any GPU artifacting going on. And again, as you can see, we're at 2970 megahertz. So by rules of rounding up, we're kind of already at 3000 megahertz, but I'm not quite comfortable until it says that. And we also get a pass in 3D Mark. Now, you can also see on our memory, we're almost at 11,000 megahertz, which is insane, but so far everything looks good. And then jumping over into the second scene to make sure everything's a go, and just to see what the frequency or what the core clock kind of locks in at, and it's staying stable at about 2955 megahertz. So that's again closer to that 3000 megahertz. I can't quite round up in this scenario, but this scene again is just proven to be a little bit more taxing on this game. But this scene also looks good, and the overclock at these figures pass the first two phases of the synthetic benchmark. So I'm going to go back in MSI Afterburner and yes, add plus 100 on the core and plus 200 on the memory. So we're right back here in MSI Afterburner. We passed that overclock run at 156 on the core and 300 on the memory. So now we're going to add another 100 on top of that, which is going to put us at plus 256. So we're at about 260 on the core, plus 500 on the memory. We are a little more than 50% past our initial overclocking target. So I'm going to go ahead and hit check, close the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark, and open it up again and run those same two portions of that benchmark to see if we get a pass. All right, now to be transparent here, we ran into an issue with the plus 260 on the core, plus 500 on the memory. Now here's what happens when I try to open up Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I tried it numerous times off camera, maybe thinking it was some outlier issues, but once the problem is repeatable, it's clear evidence that you have an underlying issue going on. In our case, that's with our overclock. So here's what happens when I open up Shadow of the Tomb Raider, right? Starting the game. Game starts up as normal. I thought everything was looking good and we were ready to cook, ready to test that overclock. But as soon as I just hit OK, and this happens. Game just crashes out. Can't even load. Can't even load. That wasn't happening to us, fam, before we dialed in this overclock. And I'm going to do this right now on camera to kind of demonstrate why you want to kind of start in slower increments. I hate to admit it, but at least with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a good indicator that the MSI Gaming X Slim, the RTX 4070 Super, isn't stable. If it's not stable in one game, in my opinion, it's not a stable overclock at all. And I would be reluctant to think that it would even pass the 3D Mark benchmark. But I am going to scale this down a bit just to see if we're able to get past Shadow of the Tomb Raider crashing before we can even get into the menu. So I'm going to dial it back down to, we had 150 before we went plus 100 on the core. So now I'm just going to go to a flat plus 200 on the core, and that would be just adding like plus 50 on top of that overclock. And then I'm going to dial the memory back to about 400, and that's us going back to just going in our 50 to 100 ratio on the core and clock. Okay, so now that we have that dialed in, or that's back up to plus to, we want to go up to 200. There we go. So now that I have that dialed in, I'm going to go ahead back, open up Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and see if we get that same system crash. So here we are, opening up Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Let's see if we can get past the menu. Let's see if 200 on the core, 400 on the memory is at least stable in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So far, so good. And would you look at that? We're able to jump into it and actually do what we weren't able to achieve. But so far, I mean, at first glance, we are a little over 3000 megahertz, but we're not in the actual benchmark. The graphics card can do, you know, it can run as fast as it needs to because it's really not rendering much here in the menu screen. So we're going to run the benchmark and see what the GPU core clock speed stays locked in at. On top of that, to see what our memory clock speed stays locked in at. Now, initially going in, we're right at the 3000 megahertz range, like right there. And so that means in the next scene, it's going to be just a little lower. So maybe I will add that plus 25 megahertz and see if it's stable, just to see if we can stay at a consistent 3000 megahertz. And while this graphics card has an insane boost, because its base clock frequency is about 1980 megahertz, which is insane. I remember at the time I was trying to overclock my 1080 Ti to that number, but it is running at a base clock frequency of about 1980 megahertz. So it already has, and would you look at that? No, we ran into a crash. Wow. So couldn't quite get there to 3000 megahertz. I wonder if we dial the memory back a little bit, but keep the GPU core clock speed at where it's at. Will that allow us to pass the benchmark? But we got a crash right in the middle of my take. So frustrating. All right, we're going to jump back into it. So let's dial, and we might have got, well, we might have got a system hiccup. Oh, okay, no. All right, so now here's what we're going to do. We're going to dial the memory back first, okay? We're going to dial the memory back first to see if maybe that's causing an issue there with loading textures, and that maybe the memory overclock is just wonky or not quite doing it. So we're going to dial that back a great deal. Keep the GPU core clock at where it's at and see if that allows us to pass the portion of the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. Here's the fun part with overclocking, the trial and error part. I'll do my best in post to shorten the length of this video, but there is a lot of trial and error associated with overclocking. As you can see, even here now, we got a system crash while I was in the middle of a take. But we're going to see if we can get the overclock to pass by dialing down the frequency on the memory core, leaving the GPU core the same, because I don't want to shy any further away from that 3000 mark, because we're barely teetering there as it is. So we crashed very early in the first portion of the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. So it's a good sign if we make it at least 30-60 seconds in before we get a crash. Decreasing the overclock on the memory has allowed the graphics card to go just a little bit further, because we're over the 3000 mark. And so far we didn't crash initially where we crashed before. So far so good. We passed the first portion where we crashed a few seconds ago, and now we're going to see if we can pass the second portion, and then on top of that, the third portion. Again, we're at 3000 megahertz, but I suspect that, sans any crashes, that it'll slightly decrease here in this scene. But going in, it looks like so far so good in this scene as well. And we are at about 3000 megahertz. We're bouncing back and forth between like 2970 or 3000 megahertz, but it's dialed in at a solid 3000 megahertz. And just like that, I spoke too soon. So we got another system crash, almost made it towards the end, but it did not fly. So that tells me that this graphics card may not be stable at 3000 megahertz. I don't see temperature being an issue there. Had plenty of power available to it. This could just be that, well, I have not won the Silicon Lottery with this graphics card. 3000 megahertz would have been nice, but if I change the core to try to get it stable, I think that might affect it. But yeah, after dialing minus 50 on the memory, we were able to get a slightly higher number on the core. So we're going to dial that back a little more just to see if we can get a pass in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, keeping the core clock frequency the same. We crashed at the later part of the benchmark, so we'll go ahead and see if we pass still the first two portions of the benchmark and make our way through the third. We do that, then we'll go ahead and test two other synthetic benchmarks, and also 3D Mark to see if we have a stable overclock. And now here we are coming up on the third portion of the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. It passed the first two, but it's here where we crashed previously. So I'm eager to see if we can make it past this portion of the benchmark, which would complete the whole entire benchmark, as you'll see at the end. And then we'll test two other games, test 3D Mark, and then we'll reveal some before and after comparisons with the overclock, without the overclock, to see exactly what the yields and the gains were with these particular games that we're going to test. And speaking of testing games, it crashed again. Wow. So that leads me to believe that the issue could be on the core and not necessarily on the memory. on the core, not on the memory. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to dial the core down. That kind of leaves us back to where we were earlier in the overclock. And we're going to leave the memory the same because I knew we were stable at about 400. So maybe we'll dial the memory back up to 350. So now we're at 156 on the core, plus 360 on the memory. Going to see if that's going to give us a stable overclock. Dialing the core back will put us under that 3000 megahertz range. So I won't be able to likely hit my targeted overclock with 3000 megahertz. But nonetheless, we could be a little close. And all fairness of overclocking, it just could mean that I didn't win the silicone lottery, that this graphics card is just not a good overclocking unit. But it is being, again, dynamically overclocked on top of this manual overclock. The base clock frequency is 1980 megahertz, and we are well over that mark by the century, if you will. I'm going to jump back in here, see if we get a pass now with those numbers we applied on overclock. And I'm just going to start from the beginning and just kind of let it run all the way to that third segment of the benchmark. And here we are at that third portion. We're at 2955 megahertz, 10,808 on the megahertz on the memory, on the core of the memory. And we'll see if we'll get a crash. It was a little past this mountain range seen here where we ran into the crash. So we'll see if we make it past there. And if we do, if we make it past the benchmark, then we may go ahead and explore other games to test to see if it's stable, if this overclock is stable, and a few other heavy hitting synthetic benchmarks. And yeah, we got a pass, so that looks good. And I don't think I'm going to bother or test Shadow of the Tomb Raider anymore. But as you can see here, with the pass in Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark, we're at plus 156 on the core, plus 360 on the memory. We crashed out at plus 200 on the core, and we couldn't even adjust to, say, lower the memory, but we also crashed out at plus 400 on the memory. So we're at plus 156 on the core, plus 360 on the memory, past Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I'm going to go ahead and fire up Red Dead Redemption 2 to see if we can pass some of the beginning portions of that synthetic benchmark. And if we do, and it passes the entire benchmark, then we'll jump into one more game and then test 3D Mark 1440p benchmark to get a final grade. And now here you can see we're in the menu settings for Red Dead Redemption 2. We're at 2560 by 1440p, and everything is set to just about ultra down here in the graphics settings. And now we're going to run at plus 156 overclock on the core and plus 360, a little bit over 360 overclock on the memory to see if the overclock passes the Red Dead Redemption 2 synthetic benchmark. And now here we are in the first portion of the Red Dead Redemption 2 benchmark, and our GPU and our memory core frequencies are about the same as they were in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Not quite at 3000 megahertz, but we are dangerously hovering there. For rounding up, then we're there, but again, it doesn't say 3000 megahertz, so we're not quite there. But we're going to go ahead and do the complete Red Dead Redemption 2 synthetic benchmark, see if we get a pass. And again, if we do get a pass in Red Dead Redemption 2 and in 3D Mark's 1440p benchmark, and maybe even Unigine Valley, just to be sure, we're going to call this overclock a successful one and just kind of save that profile in MSI Afterburner should I want to dial it up and revisit that overclock again. But even in the Red Dead Redemption 2 benchmark, so far the graphics card hasn't hit 60 degrees C. Nothing's really changed on the memory or on the GPU core. So suffice it to say, I don't anticipate the overclock crashing out here in Red Dead Redemption 2. So I am eager to see if we can get a pass in 3D Mark. Like, that's the real test. If we can get a pass in 3D Mark, then the overclock is definitely a successful one. But getting past here in Red Dead Redemption 2 and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, two graphically demanding games, and in games that really push your graphics cards to its limits, I think that really says something about the overclock. Should we get it to pass in those two games and 3D Mark, that is a high chance or high probability that the overclock will be stable in other games. But yeah, it looks like we're going to pass the Red Dead Redemption 2 benchmark here. And once that happens, jump into one more benchmark, 3D Mark, and then go ahead and go over some of the numbers that the overclock yielded and any significant performance gains that would even warrant its use. All right, and then the last synthetic benchmark we're going to test, this plus 150, plus 360 GPU core memory overclock, is another beloved video game in the gamers pantheon, and that is GTA 5, running a slightly wonky resolution here, but I'd have to change it to full screen. And we're running game at 2560 by 1440p. Everything's turned to very high ultra. Everything's dialed all the way up. And we're going to see if the overclock will pass. And now, as you can see here in the first portion of the GTA 5 benchmark, we're still at about the same GPU frequency and memory frequency that we were in both Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Red Dead Redemption 2, and now here in GTA 5 as well. We are not hitting the 3000 megahertz mark because of math, but and stability issues and woes. But here in GTA 5, we're still hovering at about the same frequency that we were, keeping the overclock consistent even here in GTA 5. So I don't expect any system crashes or issues here in GTA 5 because there weren't any in Red Dead Redemption 2, same developer, and there weren't any in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So the final test will be 3D Mark, and that will give us a final pass here with this overclock. So as you can see here, we passed the GTA 5 benchmark, no issues there. So we're going to test the game in 3D Mark and see if it passes in 3D Mark, and then go ahead and give this overclock a pass. Okay, and now here we are in 3D Mark, the, if you will, go-to for benchmarking for your systems, and they have a plethora of other benchmarks you can choose from. I went with the TimeSpy DirectX 12 synthetic benchmark, and that's because the RTX 4070 Super is more along the lines of a 1440p graphics card. It can handle 4K. For the most part, it handles well, or is at its best at 1440p. So I opted for the TimeSpy DirectX 12 benchmark, and it has 2 graphic tests in this benchmark, and I opted out for the CPU test and just the 2 graphics tests because essentially that's what we want to focus on with our overclock. And now we're going to test TimeSpy, see if we can get the overclock to pass in TimeSpy. And once it passes in TimeSpy, suffice it to say, this is a successful overclock. Not quite the figure I wanted to achieve, but we're close enough that I'm able to call it a victory or a W. And now here we are in the first graphic test, where we're running about the same GPU frequency we were in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Red Dead Redemption 2, and GTA 5. GPU temperatures are bouncing between the mid 50s and the high 60s, but so far so good. We are running high FPS here in 3D Mark, but we're going to cross our fingers and hope we get a successful pass in this synthetic benchmark. And if we do, suffice it to say, we can call this overclock a successful one, a stable one, even better. And now here we are in the second portion of the synthetic benchmark, the second graphics test. And again, we are bouncing somewhere between 28 to 2900 megahertz, so slightly slower than even in the first graphics test, and even slower than some of the games or the other synthetic benchmarks we tested on this overclock. And for the first time, I'm seeing temperatures hit that 60-degree mark or a little higher. So that's kind of concerning, but not all that concerning. But we did pass that 60 mark, but we are running a GPU fan speed of only 50%. So that's that. If I wanted to lower the temperature, I could, but I don't think it would really do too much for this overclock. And we passed 3D Mark. We got a score of 21,183. Not bad. More importantly, I wanted to see if we can get this overclock to pass 3D Mark TimeSpy, and we did. So I'm going to go ahead and say this GPU was able to hit plus 150 on the core, plus 300 on the memory, plus 360 on the memory, actually, I'm sorry, plus 150 on the GPU core, plus 350 on the memory, and it was stable in Red Dead Redemption 2 synthetic benchmark, GTA 5 synthetic benchmark, Shadow of the Tomb Raider synthetic benchmark at 2560 by 1440p. And now what I'm going to do is go ahead and save this overclock on memory profile 1, and it's saved. So if you bounce to 2, and then what I'm going to do is revert these numbers back to its factory settings, test GTA 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider to kind of see what the difference is in FPS with and without the overclock, to also see was it all worth it. And now there goes the overclocking portion of this video. We were able to add about plus 160 on the GPU core and about plus 360 on the memory core. Now, this didn't really correlate to a significant bump or boost in FPS. I mean, they were marginal at best, adding anywhere between like 2 to 3 extra frames in the games we tested. Games like Red Dead Redemption 2 didn't necessarily benefit from the overclock. The overclock added only about 2 to 3 frames, if you will. Same thing with Grand Theft Auto 5. The overclock really didn't give us a boost in FPS, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider didn't really add or increase the FPS any more or less than it already was running at with the dynamic GPU boost enabled, which altogether this graphics card has about a 1000 megahertz overclock. So yeah, our manual overclock led to an insignificant bump or boost in performance between 2 to 3 frames at best. And now, does this mean overclocking is nothing more than just a silicon sport? And doing so is nothing more than just that, like just for the thrill or excitement to see how far you could push your graphics card. Because newer graphics cards like the RTX 30 and 40 series and RDNA 2 and 3 graphics cards really don't need to be overclocked at all. They're already boosting themselves to about 2 gigahertz or a little over 2 gigahertz. And these graphics cards like the RDNA 2 and 3 and newer RTX graphics cards like the 30 and 40 series and even the RTX 20 series, they're taking full advantage of GPU dynamic boost, which is pushing the graphics card frequency as high as it can given the temperature headroom the graphics card has. So disabling GPU dynamic boost would have played a minimum role with this overclock. Typically you want to do that to conserve power and temps, or if you're mining, if you still do that. For example, the RTX 4070 Super has a boost clock frequency of up to 2475 megahertz and a base clock frequency of about 1980 megahertz. But in real time, like when we were running our GPU benchmarks and even 3D Mark, we saw the GPU frequency reach up to about 27 to 2800 megahertz without the overclock. Like even now in the Valley synthetic benchmark, the GPU is boosting up to 2800 megahertz, and this is without the overclock. So our overclock added about plus 150 on top of that, giving this GPU a nearly 1000 megahertz overclock, being that again, its base clock frequency is about 1980 megahertz. And we were able to reach about 2975 megahertz or 2980 megahertz in a stable overclock, nearly 3000 gigahertz. And that was my original target at the beginning of this video. But this graphics card arguably couldn't overclock much further than that. And really, given that we didn't get a significant boost in performance, it really didn't need to. So overclocking could be a waste of time, if not just for sport, or to help you speed up legacy hardware, considering that you could just be enjoying your games and your media. But again, if you're running a legacy card like a GTX 900 series, like a 970 or 980 or 980 Ti, or a 10th generation graphics card like a 7080 or an 80 Ti, overclocking those graphics cards could be worth it to speed it up in modern games. AMD graphics cards in the past haven't been known to be great overclockers, especially if you're running like an RX 5000 or an RX 6000 series graphics card. You're not going to get much more out of the core. But if you're willing to jump in and give it a risk and get dirty here in MSI Afterburner or EVGA software, then it could be worth it again to speed up legacy hardware if you're unable to hit a stable FPS in your games. But that's all I got for this one, y'all. If you haven't yet, like this video for me on your way in or on your way out. If you're new to the community, hit the subscribe button for me with the notification bell turned on. I hit a wall, and with your help, we can break through it. But I do hope to catch you all in the next one. So until then, be easy.